In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
Enough! I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me!
Gandalf? Not the Wandering Wizard.
The same.
To dungeons deep and caverns. We must away ere break of day.
Welcome. Bruchim Abbaim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together, starting with just a little love for the hobbit of my childhood, lest we forget the charming beauty of Rankin and Bass's 1977 foray into putting the unfilmable, what was at the time unfilmable, onto the screen. Which brings me to, like so many youths whose childhood was mostly characterized by being an outsider, I was drawn to fantasy books. J.R.R. Tolkien became a constant companion already by age 8, and by my early teens, my entire bookshelf bore the names of Brooks, Eddings, Feist, Chalker, Lackey, Donaldson, and Le Guin. Next to these sat the box whose magic contents included dice with 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 20 sides, all necessary to allow my friends and I to take the worlds that these great authors conjured into our minds into darkened basements for weekend sleepovers devoted to Dungeons and Dragons. In a world where I walked to school carrying my clarinet, I was mercilessly mocked and bullied. In my world playing a half-elven magic user, I would ready a sleep spell as our thief opened the dungeon door, and as I cast the spell on the band of orcs within, all my friends would act as if I'd actually done it. Addiction doesn't even begin to describe these books and games. Looking back, survival might perhaps be a little closer. Of course, worried parents eyed the books with swirling covers and suggestive portraits. Marketing of fantasy in the 80s tended to be a bit more overt than today. They weren't the only books on my shelves, simply the most prominent and most loved in their clearly worn jackets proclaiming multiple readings. Yet some of those other non-fantasy books that sat somewhere on the shelf seemed to, let's say, problematize Pug's desire to become a capable magician as Colgan's apprentice, Sparrowhawk's uncovering of his innate power, or perhaps worst of all, Karl Kulinen, Walter Slavatsky and friends being transferred by their dungeon master into the, as it turns out, real world that they had assumed was only play. And yes, that was a shout out. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite fantasy book or series was from your youth, and if you recognized any of the plots that I just dropped. One of those other books, the one with the much more sober binding that would eventually become the center of my teaching life as a rabbi, held and still holds these damning words. There must not be found among you anyone that makes his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, a soothsayer or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a medium, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination to the Eternal. And because of these abominations, the Eternal, your God, drives them out before you. Now, in spite of my leisure reading and gaming choices, I still excelled in school, never really got in trouble, and even started working nearly full-time at age 16. But the contradiction in that passage between my religious obligation and my literary choices bothered my parents so much that eventually I was forced to dispose of my dice and hide what books I was reading. Indeed, these words from Parashat Shoftim have been in my home country, in the States now, behind decades of book burnings of everything from those already listed to Twilight and Harry Potter in more recent days. Ignoring for this sermon that the witches and sorcerers imagined in the minds of those burning these books dates back to medieval times at best, instead of the fully different folks being spoke of in Deuteronomy texts, I'll go ahead and link below to my What Does a Witch Look Like video where I address this aspect. There is another more subtle problem with this passage, and it's apparent decrying of the occult. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, much of Parashat Shoftim lays out what we might describe as a constitution for Temple Judaism, including separation of powers and governmental duties. Surprise, surprise. Whereas today we might look at executive, legislative, and judicial branches in Western democracies, ancient Judah was not so far apart in its division of duties among those who dealt with civil and religious law. But since this is an old religious book, it's easy to discount the sophistication of the system. More importantly, it's easy to ignore the political polemic underneath much of this constitution. You see, the problem with throwing copies of Harry Potter into a bonfire, other than the obvious, highly problematic image of book burnings in general. I mean, serious, you who out there think it's okay to burn books, do you have no sense of history and rant? Is that it seems like the readers stop at, "You shall have no," and then witch or sorcerer, and forget to read what comes at the end of the passage. And I quote, "Instead, the Eternal your God will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people. Like myself, you shall heed the prophet." Ultimately, the purpose of this passage is less to figure out which books need to be burned and more to constitutionally list who is allowed to do what in kosher ancient Jewish society. The king was to raise armies, impose taxes, and keep civil order. The priesthood was responsible for religious ritual, health, and purity, and adjudicating certain legal disputes. The prophets were the ones responsible for trying to understand the will of the Eternal. Maybe not the easiest job. According to the constitutional nature of this part of Torah, this should be done through a prophet. However it was that they did what they did, and not through a sorcerer. Yes, the text is a little extreme in its language. I'll get to that at the end. But seriously, what does it matter today? Last week, we talked about the democratization of a priestly role, but fascinatingly, one of the great leaps forward in rabbinical Judaism was the democratization of all of these Torah roles. For hundreds of years, there had already not been a Davidic king, and after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, there was no longer a need for a priesthood for a temple that no longer existed in a city we were forbidden by Roman law to visit. Instead of a king, for 2,000 years, we embraced the legal concept of dina d'malchuta dina, or the law of the land shall be your law, and sadly paid the price far too often for lacking political agency. There is, as an aside, an ideal in this concept of self-governance inside a larger governmental structure and the spiritual focus that is lost in the memory of that heavy price we repeatedly paid. And then, regarding the priesthood, we replaced temple sacrifices with the obligation of daily prayer. Last week's video. This, I think, can only be seen as a powerful spiritual evolution. Instead of a tiny amount of people that could approach the Eternal, it was all of our responsibility. But what about prophecy? According to Jewish law, prophecy ended with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. In good old American English, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And even a voice from heaven would not be counted or matter as would have a prophetic voice during the time of the prophets. But if the previous two constitutional powers were essentially distributed among the people, what do we do about prophecy? Where did that go? Am I now supposed to be prophet light? Prayer is about going before the Eternal, but it's not necessarily understanding the revelatory truths that we might encounter there. So the question is, have any of us ever in our lives asked,
"Please explain to me what the heck is going on?"
If so, or any of the untold analogs to this question, and we consider ourselves bound to Torah tradition, we have a problem. There seems to be a long list of the types of people in Torah that at one time were able to ask these questions of the universe, including prophets, soothsayers, diviners, necromancers, witches, and sorcerers. All but the prophets seem to still be around. If prophecy ended, how do we understand the deeper mysteries now? Is it time to go get the tarot cards? Now, before we go there, and I see how many people don't listen to the end and stop at this point, assuming that they know what I'm about to say, and I'm guessing you don't, it's worth looking back to see what the rabbis of the Talmud did to answer this question. And since this is also central to my doctoral dissertation, I am obligated, morally, to inflict these ideas on as many congregations, including virtual ones, as possible, although the discussion has certainly gone over far better in some former congregations than others.
Who would have thought discussing the occult was controversial in any way?
But moving out of looking at things super or supranaturally and moving back into seeing the development of our tradition as a human process, the begged question is, why did the rabbis say that prophecy had ended? The full answer would require volumes, but the short answer is that the end of prophecy was part of the case that the rabbis had to make to ensure their own position. Now, if that sounds terribly uncomfortable, then now's a good time to look at the ways in which every one of us tries to win and hold influence at some level of our lives. This wasn't unethical, it was human. And far more importantly, with the end of Temple Judaism, which meant Judaism as everyone knew it up to that point, it was also necessary and frankly saved Judaism. So yay sages, but also the sages did act pragmatically. Which makes sense because the rabbi's job was tough. The central books of their and our religious tradition spoke of a complete system that no longer existed. Temple, priest, prophet, Jerusalem. The first thing they had to do was to build the case using those same books that were written for the sake of temple, priest, prophet, Jerusalem, and make the case that the will of the Eternal was not empty ritual, but rather a type of personal and societal devotion. In making that case, the prophet Isaiah's words were central to this shift and were quoted often by the rabbis. "What need have I of all of your sacrifices, says the Eternal? Learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow." The prophets of the past were central to the rabbinical evolution of Judaism, but prophecy itself, as a daily element of Judaism, was highly problematic. Let me explain, because this is really, really important. After the destruction of the temple, a whole new series of laws and daily regulations needed to be written, with the case made that these were the oral traditions passed on at Sinai. And as yet another aside note, I will always argue that the oral law is a real thing, but rather than specific laws, the oral version of Sinaitic revelation was the process of dialogue upon which all Judaism is based. In the Sinaitic tradition, however, Moses as a prophet was a conduit to the new laws that were accepted by the Jewish people, because the prophet's job, Moses being the greatest of them, was to interpret the voice of God. Let's put that in scare quotes. God's not a bearded dude. We use human language to describe the undescribable. But because the prophet's job was to interpret the voice of God, the very center of their being was to bring into Jewish consciousness revelatory concepts. Put much more simply, the rabbis were trying to make Judaism without a temple relevant and make the case that the laws and regulations in the Mishnah and later Talmud were authentic and came from Moses. And here's the important thing. A new prophet could very easily muck that up. And this is why we find passages, stories in the Talmud where a literal voice from heaven tells the rabbis that they're wrong, to which the rabbis reply, "Lo b'shamayim hi." Yeah, Torah's not in heaven. Longer paraphrase. You gave it to us. For good or for ill, you, Eternal, are going to have to trust us with the evolution of Sinai in the same way we trusted you at Sinai. The very existence of rabbinical Judaism is a democratization of the receiving of law. Talmud acknowledges that the prophetic voice still existed, the ability to engage with the voice of God, known as the Bat Kol, or the daughter of the voice, yet it no longer had the ability to change halakha. Only we, for good or for ill, can do that, which, with so many false, bad, and dangerous prophets in Jewish history since the Talmudic times, the wisdom of the sages has been proven over and over. That wisdom protected us, or at least tried, from our worst impulses to follow passionate and charismatic voices that seem to know more about us than we ourselves do. That seem to promise an easy way out when things get really hard. Yeah, we didn't have a Jonestown, but we certainly had Shabbatai Tzvi and far too many others of his ilk. And yet that prophetic voice still floats around out there. Hand in hand with this exists the desire to indeed need to figure out what's going on in our lives, especially when all seems to be falling apart. We bang our heads against the wall and weep and gnash our teeth and cry out, why? And then we ask our friends, and when they don't give us the answer that we want to hear, well, that shop on the corner of Main and First with the neon palm, $5 tarot readings and promised spiritual cleansing seems mighty tempting. Ironically, the sages of the Talmud understood clearly that the end of official prophecy would not end our desire to seek wisdom wherever we could. Perhaps surprisingly, if you've never spent much time in the Talmud, rather than repeating the prohibition of all magics, the sages instead discuss the difference between charlatanism and what they consider authentic magic. And it was discussed enough that over the years, this led to a final listing of the Hilchot Kesem, the Jewish laws relating to the use of magic in the Shulchan Aruch. The final answer, written into the most authoritative codex of Jewish law still in effect today, not surprisingly, is that most magic is forbidden. How's that for an interesting keyword? The reasons, however, are really insightful. The issue, as discussed by the rabbis, is that most of us use or seek magic, however it is we wish to understand that, either to seduce people from their life's path or to gratify one's own ego. The final law, pretty explicitly stated in the Shulchan Aruch, is that only magic used to serve the will of the Eternal, with no personal ego or agenda thrown in, is allowed. Which, if we're being quite honest, means that magic is not allowed unless you know of anyone who doesn't exist in a perpetual state of enlightened self-interest. And yet, we keep coming back to the void and the question of where or if prophecy was truly democratized in the same way that sacrifice was. The clue lies back with our Torah text from Parashat Shoftim, that from these formative texts, magic was set on the one side in opposition to prophecy on the other. You may not have this, instead, you may have this. Both may fulfill on the surface the same need, but the methodology is radically different. Critically, also included in Shoftim are the requirements of a prophet and how we can understand that a prophet is not a false prophet. The summary of all that could be easily expressed by the laws of magic 2,000 years later. That if what a prophet does is solely for the sake of the eternal, that's a prophet. Otherwise, they are, surprise, surprise, a conduit for the frailty of human ego. Put more bluntly, the nature of humanity means that the archetypal sorcerer will tell us what we want to hear, whereas the purpose of a prophet is to only tell us what we need to hear. How much of this shift in difference is needed today, where algorithms direct us into rooms with a hallelujah chorus of exactly and only what we want to hear? We as a society do not react well or healthily to voices that contradict this. When is the last time any of us have had a long discussion with someone with whom we profoundly disagreed and the discussion ended positively? The democratization of prophecy is the thing we have most failed at grasping. By setting magic and prophecy against each other, we were to learn not only to listen to the still small voice that is the eternal voice speaking always, only to be drowned out by the noise of our groups, tribes, and personal ego. The prophetic system was not meant to destroy the livelihood of a sorcerer or a diviner. It was meant to save us from ourselves. The calling of them an abomination is the larger acknowledgement that seeking mysteries only for personal gain will always tear us apart rather than lifting us up, and that the path is incredibly narrow when it comes to entering deep mysteries for the sake of unknown knowledge. The elevating and iterative question directs us to that still, small voice. We are the inheritors of the prophetic voice. We are. The manifestation of this is practically interpretation and dialogue with our sacred texts. Our obligation to study Torah is a part of that ultimate democratization. But the underlying mystical beauty is that we are as much a part as the revelatory process as our ancestors through all that we do, our prayer, our good works, and our service. A mystical interpretation of Sinai is that the miracle was not that we for once collectively heard the voice of God. It's that we were all for once collectively quiet enough to hear what is perpetually there. What place have we made in our lives? Have we made any place in our lives to be still enough to hear that which we were all created to hear? Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.
To measure the meaning can make you delay. It's time you stop thinking and wasting the day.